Workers' Memorial Day. I want to welcome you all here. My name is Steve Zeltzer, and I'm with the Injured Workers National Network and have been involved in a long struggle to defend injured workers, whistleblowers, and working people who are fighting for justice, human rights on the job. And every year we have this meeting to commemorate those workers who are fighting on the job, and also to remember those workers who've died on the job, because workers are being killed every day in this country, and not in accidents, but because of the fact that there's not health and safety protection on the job, that companies are getting away with literally murder in this country. And that has to stop. That has to stop. And we here in San Francisco and the Bay Area, you would think that we don't have mines, we don't have heavy industry, but people are still getting injured because we have toxic dump sites, and we have companies like Wells Fargo and PG&E and other big companies who think that they're above the law, and they ignore the law. So we're going to have speakers talk about these issues, and we have to build a movement, really, of all working people in the unions to defend ourselves on the job. And unfortunately, we can't rely on the government in many cases, because the government agencies like OHSA and other agencies have been captured by the very companies they're supposed to regulate. So when workers file charges and complaints, they find out that nothing happens to them. And we're going to have talk today about what happens to whistleblowers who are bullied. And that's the other aspect of this Workers' Memorial Day, and that is there's an epidemic of workplace bullying going on in this country. Workers are being terrorized on the job to do all kinds of things. I mean, to do dangerous jobs that they know will hurt or injure or even kill them, and also who don't want to do illegal things, like at Wells Fargo Bank, who don't want to open up fake bank accounts. So imagine a country in which you're ordered to do illegal things and you refuse to do it and you're fired and nothing happens to the company. That's what we got going on in this country. You know, people are ordered to do illegal things and there's no accountability. And in California, we have 18.5 million workers in California. It's the largest state in the largest population in the United States. And there are less than 200 OSHA inspectors in the United States, in California, for 18.5 million workers. And we'll talk about that. I mean, because if there are no inspectors from OSHA, Cal-OSHA, how can you know what's really going on in the workplace? And one of the struggles that we had this year in the Bay Area was Henkel Aerodynamics. And that was a plant that produced adhesives in Pittsburgh. And what happened there is, and this kind of typifies what's going on, is that workers, they would hire temporary workers, and there was a large number of temporary workers who are brought into a job and not properly trained. They bring in workers, they have 15, 20 days on the job, and then they put them on machines. And in this case, a worker was pulled into a machine and killed at this plant. And as a result of that, the workers decided they have a union to organize in the IEM. They formed a union. And the first time around, they got a union contract. The second time around, the company said, we don't want to agree to stronger health and safety protections. So they forced them out on strike and hired a company called Strom Engineering to bring in scabs to break the strike of the workers. And these workers had never been in a union, had never been on strike. They had no experience, but what they had is solidarity. What they had is that they had strong rights, that they were going to defend their rights, and also the community in Pittsburgh defended them. They brought them food, they supported their picket line. And we did a video, I did a video of their strike called Murder. It was murder, what happened there when a worker is pulled in the machine, he's not getting training. And that went viral, including in Germany where the company was based. And the company didn't like that, and they told the union negotiating committee, it's a low blow. That was the word. It's a low blow. It's a low blow. Well, there are a lot of low blows that we have to give out. It's because a lot of low blows are going on against working people in this country. And we are going to put a stop to it. We're going to organize against it, and we're going to educate people. And so the first speaker we're going to have is a doctor who has been in a long-time struggle to protect Cal-OSHA. He was medical director of Cal-OSHA, and he actually was trying to make sure that OSHA was there to protect people. So welcome, Dr. Larry Rose.
I'll make my talk three parts. One, what's happened to Cal-OSHA under the leadership of Jerry Brown appointee Christine Baker, what's happened to her recently in the way of corruption, and what's happening at Hunters Point as a model for what the dysfunction of an agency like Cal-OSHA that has never even looked at Hunters Point. So let's start with Cal-OSHA. Steve mentioned some of it, which is this agency. I started in the first Jerry Brown administration when we had 7 public health medical officer doctors on board. We were working with the Department of Health, and we took the lead in a number of very important investigations to protect workers. And then at one point, they decided to transfer us over, all the doctors, to the Department of Industrial Relations. At that time, Don Weil was the director of that, and Art Carter was the head of Cal-OSHA. Now, at that time, there were only about 11 million workers in California. Now there are 18.5 million workers in California. The number of extra, we call them enforcement officers, that were brought on board at Cal-OSHA, they did not increase adequately. So at this point, we have 1 enforcement officer per 90,000 workers in California, which is ridiculous. This is the 6th biggest economy in the world in California, and it has a lot of very highly polluting industries and terrible exposures of the workers. And what happened was they gradually diminished both what we were allowed to do as doctors in the OSHA program, but also the number of doctors, till finally, over the years, I was the last remaining public health medical officer in Cal-OSHA, which is outrageous. When you go in to do an inspection, you have to talk to the workers. You have to look at their medical history, the doctors that have been treating them for these work-related injuries and illness, and you have to come up with a remediation that is in direct proportion to what we found. Well, that became impossible for me toward the end of my stay there because there were just too many places to go at once. So what happened in 2011 was Jerry Brown appointed a woman named Christine Baker. Now, Christine Baker was a new director of the Department of Industrial Relations with that huge explosion at the Chevron plant. Most of you probably remember that in March of 2012. I mean, that was a shocking event where the management at that Chevron plant created that problem. That was a leaky pipe. They let it go. They told the 20 workers to keep it going, and it exploded, and this mushrooming cloud went up. 15,000 inhabitants of Richmond, California had to go to the emergency rooms. The 20 workers barely escaped with their lives. They ran like hell, and they just missed being destroyed. So with that event, I started closely looking at, well, what is Cal-OSHA, how are they going to handle this? Well, they did go in and they did investigate, and they did a fairly good, I would call it medium good investigation. It didn't go to the core of it, which was what criminals were responsible for this occurrence at the Chevron plant. But this was never done. They have a legal unit at Cal-OSHA. They never sent them in. But what did happen was a friend of mine who came on board with me when Jerry Brown's first administration was the chief of Cal-OSHA at that point. She had been a long time kind of liberal Democrat, and she got the appointment, Ellen Wydess. So she oversaw the investigation, and what happened was it took a long time, and I started asking, what's going on? 6 months later, she did do the right thing. She came up with 7 serious violations, willful. Willful means that management knew this was going to happen and allowed it to happen, in fact, helped it happen. So this story goes on. I don't want to go into, because this is the point. I'm trying to point out that Cal-OSHA at this point is almost a non-functioning agency under Christine Baker. She has ridden herd over. She replaced Ellen Wydess 2 months later, kicked her out, put in somebody who was going to be basically a do-nothing chief of Cal-OSHA. And that's what Cal-OSHA is doing now. Virtually nothing. They haven't even looked at Hunters Point. Okay, so to go on about Christine Baker, she just resigned 2 months ago. You say, oh, how did that happen? And then it came out in the Chronicle that she was being investigated for fraud, called nepotism fraud. She brought on her brother and gave him huge raises, and he just retired too, mysteriously. And she brought on her daughter, and who's been working there for a couple of years, never goes in the office and gets a big paycheck. So, that is, she should be brought up on charges, criminal charges, and nothing's being done right now. We'll see what happens with that. And the thing I want to get into, though, I guess, is this: what is occurring at Hunters Point is a monument, the worst eco-fraud in the history of the United States. That's how bad it is. What was going on at Hunters Point? The Navy from 1946 to 1964 was doing ionizing radiation experiments on animals and some volunteers. And these were the spewing of ionizing radiation nuclides from these experiments was just, it wasn't controlled. It polluted the whole 450 acres at Hunters Point. Okay, after that, what occurred was they were setting off these hydrogen bomb, remember that? Hydrogen bomb explosions in the Pacific Ocean. And they put a lot of Navy ships out there. And those Navy ships were downwind, and they got highly polluted. Where did they go? They went to Hunters Point for cleanup. And where does that cleanup residue go? It spreads all over the place. The air, the soil, whatever water's there, etc., the buildings. So Hunters Point is a highly radioactive polluted area, no question. And these radioactive nuclides are radioactive for tens of thousands of years. This is not something that's sort of, 10, 15 years down the line. This will get, diluted with time. No, it doesn't get diluted with time. And then the Navy brings in, I'll put it, a crooked group of testers, a corporation, and they do the testing, and they find out that the testing was all fraudulent, all of it. And Tetra Tech is the name of the corporation. And then Tetra Tech proceeded to declare that large areas were free of pollution because they hadn't really tested it. They did phony testing. So then the trucks came in to haul off the polluted soils. The trucks all going through San Francisco, particularly Bayview, Hunters Point, those people who live there are exposed to truckloads of this radioactive soil. It goes to 4 solid waste disposal sites. Solid waste disposal in no way protects people against that kind of highly radioactive pollution. It's going to run off, it's going to get in the air, it's going to pollute all of the neighborhoods around those solid landfills. That too is... Okay. That too is an outrage. And, all of that has been coming out somewhat in the Chronicle, and Steve has been fantastic. He has been really on top of it and watching the whole thing develop. The workers who worked for Tetra Tech, starting around 2004 with the testing, there were, I think, 6 of them that were truth tellers or whistleblowers and said, they're not doing things right at all. In fact, they're creating false data. And all of them got fired. And, they're still fighting that battle. And Steve can tell you more about that. He knows the details. The point is, though, that we have an agency, the Department of Industrial Relations, Cal-OSHA, that should have been on top of this. Workers were getting exposed. And by the way, one other additional point is that there are a lot of other pollutants out there because this was an industrial site. You've got asbestos and the heavy metals, lead, arsenic, et cetera, cadmium. and you have a lot of industrial detergents and solvents also polluting the soil out there. So you have a panoply, and you look at that and you say, well, how are they going to remediate that? How are they going to build houses through Lennar, the big contractor? And by the way, let me just quickly tell you this, without going into the details. The politicians that are involved in this start with Willie Brown, Gavin Newsom, Ed Lee, and then you look at Pelosi, it's Pelosi's nephew that is in charge of the building, and Gavin Newsom is connected to him too. They know each other, all good friends. So now we have Pelosi intimately involved in this outrage, and Dianne Feinstein's husband, Bloom, Mr. Richard Bloom, is a big billionaire, and his corporation is connected to the development corporations out at Hunters Point, and also is connected to the development at Treasure Island. Similar kinds of pollution at Treasure Island, but now nowhere as intense, put it that way. So you ask, well, what can they do? I mean, what are they going to build on top of this, even though they haven't got it cleaned up? Well, they have a remediation they do often. We do a cap on it, 6 inches of topsoil, free of pollution. Well, what the hell is that going to get you? Plants don't go down just 6 inches in their roots. Whatever grows there or whatever gets kicked up by the weather is going to get in the air and pollute workers. And they're building, their present plan is to build something like 12,000 homes on sectors G and D. The EPA came in and looked at that. The local director of EPA Superfund sites and said 97% of the testing that was done by Tetra Tech is false, which means it was never really tested, and they were going ahead and making the plans to build these 12,000 homes, plus the commercial properties, which are going to be millions of square feet of commercial properties on those two parcels, G and B. And this just gives you an idea of the magnitude and depth of corruption going on at Hunters Point, and the lack of any adequate close looking at it, and seeing how did this occur, and why are we ever going to allow any building on there at all? That's it. Thank you.
So what I'd like to talk to you about is, as Steve said, we've been on this ongoing battle about workplace bullying for about 3 years. So we did get something in our contract. We fought and got, even though as minimal as it may be in the contract, and so we've been pushing that issue. But one of the reasons that I picked bullying as an issue is we're having a real problem with dealing with the discrimination that goes on in the workplace. And when you talk to people and you say it's about racism, management shuts down and they don't listen. But they have been listening when you call it what it is, bullying. And this bullying, it happens to African Americans, it happens to Asians, it happens to Hispanics, it's happening everywhere, to all the minority groups. And so if we don't all fight together to stop this, then it's going to continue. So we have had like major issues and just outrageous things happening to people, like people who go to a workplace, the new employees. We finally got them to start hiring black people, because for a long time they didn't hire any. And that was particularly in nursing and the higher paid positions. It was very hard or rare when black people got hired to those positions. So we got them to finally start hiring people, but the result has been that when they get in those positions, then they immediately begin to be harassed and treated differently than everybody else. And if you're in a management position and you're African American, I'm a supervisor on my job, and what we have to deal with on a daily basis from people who undermine us, who don't want us to be in those positions, who try everything there is to get you out. Now, I haven't been disciplined, but the effect is still the same. And it just so happens I'm a strong person, so I tolerate it and I fight back. But I see a lot of other people that don't fight back. They come, They leave. Cheryl got a dentist. Cheryl Thornton got a dentist to go to Potrero Hill Health Center because they were saying, we can't find any black dentists. She went and found him a black dentist. And now that person is leaving because it's so bad that people don't stay. If they have other options, they go somewhere else. So it should not be that way for the city of San Francisco. San Francisco is supposed to be a progressive city. It's supposed to be open arms to all people. But, you know, the way it's turning out is really not. It's turned out to be not a friendly city if you're African Americans. People get treated as if you're not wanted here. They don't let you in the housing. They don't, you know, it's hard to get a mortgage loan in San Francisco. You know, when I tried for 3 years to get a mortgage loan in San Francisco. Couldn't get one, but I quickly got one when I wanted to look in Antioch. So nothing else changed about me. It's just that the redlining was happening and they didn't want black families in that particular area where I was looking. So I don't know what else we can do, but I hope all of you call the city government people down in San Francisco and tell them that, you know, workers of color being mistreated is not acceptable. And we expect them to change that. And all these people running for office, we need to challenge them at every opportunity on what are you going to do about it, right? What are you going to do about it? Now, I see, I've even had incidents where I've seen whites get discriminated against, and nobody does anything. So it's not any particular group. It's the culture that needs to change. And it's a culture where people are allowed to be bullied, and management does nothing about it. Or they may call you in and they may do that, or selectively discipline people. Because the other thing we found out in 1021 is that over the whole few years, last 3 years, most of the people that are being disciplined, actually disciplined on the jobs, have been African Americans. Other people have done the same things. They just don't get disciplined. So they're being harshly disciplined more than their counterparts. So I hope that all of you call down at City Hall. I hope all of you start following this issue. We're going to have a May Day rally on the City Hall steps. I know there's a bunch of other stuff happening, but this is particularly about the way that people of color are being treated in the workplace. I mean, it's a dirty little secret in San Francisco, and we need to open that up so that it's no longer a secret and that they have to deal with it. And we need to make sure that the mayor, everybody else, has to deal with it. So my ask to everyone is, if you're listening to this, is to call downtown City Hall. If you're supporting a candidate, you need to call them and talk to them and ask them what are they going to do about it. Because this is going to affect all of the children of minority people, because the way it's going, it's going to be where our children will not be able to get jobs working for the city of San Francisco. And these are good paying jobs with good benefits. And we don't want our kids to be excluded. We want them to be included. And so that's really what I wanted to say. And I hope you guys all do that. I hope everybody calls. I'm going to keep working at it. I'm relentless. I will not stop. And I think everybody else, and other people are starting to join me now, so we just need to keep building that movement so that we all let everybody know that this is not acceptable no matter where you are.
Hello, my name is Yesenia Guitron. I was here last year, and I hope to see many of your faces. If you guys do this again next year, I hope to be here again next year. So like Steve said, I started working for banks in 1998, right out of high school, and I always knew I wanted to be a banker. And I worked for banks, and my manager would really like me, and she went to another bank, but she would bring me with her. And then she would get invited to come to another bank, do the same thing, but with a better pay. They would always bring me with them wherever they went. So I was really flattered for that. And then the market tanked, like right around 2008. And I was doing mortgages. So banking shifted to the mortgage world. And when that happened, I could no longer continue to make loans. So then I went back to the retail banking, which is where you open a checking, a savings account, equity line of credit, basic everyday stuff. So I went to work for a lady that I knew in St. Helena, and I started in 2008 for Wells Fargo. At first, I was a little hesitant because Wells Fargo had a really bad reputation for not being customer service oriented. And I was very customer service oriented, and I took pride on that. But again, market tanked. I was a single mom. I didn't have very many options, and I knew I was really good at what I was doing. So I accepted a job. And what was different about Wells Fargo from the other banks that I had worked for was that they have a 1-month-long training. So for a month, I would have to report to another branch where you're not working with customers, but they would tell you, there's this type of checking account. This account is for like a field worker, a hotel lady, this is who you give this account to. And then there's the special elite accounts for richer people that have higher balances. So they would tell you what accounts go to whom. And then they emphasized so much on ethics and do the right thing. And don't do this and don't do that. And, don't open a fake account. Don't give ATM cards and don't open credit card accounts to people that don't need it. So I was like, okay, that sounds like easy, So after my training was done, they have assigned all kinds of code of conduct and ethics things that we were trained, and we give it to our branch manager, and so we go back to the branch. And one of the things that they said is if you see something suspicious, whether you have proof or not, you have to report it. So I come to the branch, and I'm very excited. I get my new desk. I'm calling my friends and my family, come on over. Now I need to open all these accounts. I had customers following me from one bank to another. So I was like, okay, I'm set. This is it. I don't want to go anywhere else. Wells Fargo is it. Because they can do mortgage, they can do auto insurance, auto lending, anything. I'll just stay with Wells Fargo. But soon enough, I discovered that there was funky things happening. All the things that they gave me on my training of what not to do, they were doing at the branch. And at first I thought, maybe this person needs a little refresher, because to me is fresh. I just went through the training. So I went to my manager and I suggested that this person maybe have a refresher as to what was happening. And so they, I guess I gave it the benefit of the doubt, and it stopped momentarily, but then it continued. And things that would happen would be like, customers coming in with 5 debit cards. Why would someone have 5 debit cards if you only need 1 and you can only have 1 active? Or people would find out that their debit cards all of a sudden stopped working. And that's because somebody intentionally canceled it and ordered another one, because they would get commission for ordering a debit card. Other customers that I had just opened an account, I would call in about 10 days, make sure that they received their checks and they received everything and they're ready to go. They don't have any more questions. Then I would find out that the accounts that I had opened 10 days prior had been closed, and then a new set of accounts were open. And it all pointed to the same person. So the same person that I thought needed a refresher was doing it intentionally. So at that point, about a month after I had been training and working at the St. Helena branch, I did what my instructor told me to do. Report it to your manager. So I called the instructor just to make sure that that's what I needed to do, and she says, well, bring it up to your manager. I did, and nothing happened. And again, it momentarily would stop, but then it would increase as time went by. Now, I want to give everybody a picture of what St. Helena, I don't know if anybody's been to St. Helena, or you guys can locate us in the map. It's a little tiny town. It's in the heart of the Napa Valley. So there's 5,000 residents total in St. Helena. There's 14 banks for a town of 5,000 people. But we have to just forget about all the other 14 banks. We're only going to work with Wells Fargo. So one Wells Fargo for 5,000 residents. In Wells Fargo branch, there was 5 bankers, so 5 people just like myself, and all of us had to open 8 accounts. So if you guys look at the board, at the bottom of that board, it says 8 equals great. That's a Wells Fargo motto. Thank you. 8 equals great. So we all had to open 8 accounts a day. So if there's 5 bankers and we each have to open 8 accounts, that means that every single day we have to open at least 40 accounts. Now do the math. If somebody's got the phone, you can do the math. Do 5,000 divided by 40. That gives you 125. So in 125 days, I would have given every single person in St. Helena a bank account with Wells Fargo. And again, keep in mind that there's 13 other banks in town, and the competition's very tough. So I knew something was happening. So I continued to do my job. We would have meetings in the morning, and the managers would ask you, how many accounts do you commit to opening? So everybody, the managers wanted for us to say 8. But I didn't say 8 because I knew better. I knew there was no way, even with all my clients, if they came from Napa, St. Helena, regardless, I was not going to be able to open 8 accounts a day. So I would say 3. I commit to 3. And they would look at me funny, like, what are you thinking? What do you mean? And then I became sort of like the bad employee because I was not telling them what they wanted to hear. So fast forward to 2010, 2 years after I had been with Wells Fargo, I finally get fired. I reported the fake accounts on and on and on since I started. And then August of 2009, that's when things got really, really bad. And they started retaliating. And I didn't know what retaliation meant, so I had to go to the employee handbook and looked it up. And I knew that there had to be some sort of protection for workers. I'm doing this in good faith. Also, Napa Valley is known for its vineyards and its wineries. So there's a lot of field workers. And most of these people are migrant workers. They don't even speak the language. They don't even live here permanently. They're seasonal. They come, they work during harvest, and then they go back. So those customers didn't want to come back and bring any complaints. One, they would fear also retaliation. Well, what about if they call the cops? Then I get to be sent home to Mexico. They didn't even speak the language. But they really trusted anyone that was in the desks. So I would ask my manager over and over, what have you done? What are we going to do? This keeps happening. And now I have my own line, because I'm bilingual. I have my own line of people trying to put in their claims. Not only that, there's a lot of people that had credit cards that they never requested. Now, credit cards are different than debit cards. And the credit cards, they would also sign you up for rewards. So if anybody's got a credit card with rewards, you know how that works. But usually those credit cards come with an annual fee. So $69, $59, whatever it be. But they would have the debit cards and the credit cards sent to the branch. So the customer never knows that they have a credit card in their name, open in Wells Fargo.
Well, unless you check your report and then it will show, right?
Right, but remember, most of the people there were immigrants. Most of those people don't have the time or don't even have the computer to look up their activity online. Mm-hmm. Yes. So what would happen is they would get charged the annual fee and they wouldn't pay. So a month came by and then there was a late fee now. So now we have the annual fee plus the late fee. And so that goes on for several months until the bank decides to close the card. Now you're like about $200 or $300 in the negative, and you get sent to collections. So now you start getting collection calls letting you know that you have a credit card that you didn't take care of. And you have a balance of about $300 and something because, there's like the interest and all these fees, and then the collectors they charge a percentage. So that's when people start realizing, wait a minute, I never requested that debit card or that credit card. And so that's when customers would come to me and say, what happened? And then I became almost like, my full job was being an investigator. I was tracing, and, it all pointed to the one person. So again, I lost, but I knew I was being targeted because they were just making my life miserable. So in 2010, I contacted an attorney, and I said, this is what happened, and I brought about 300 cases with me. I was able to collect a lot of documentation and proof. Now they ask me, why were you doing this? Were you not afraid? And I guess in my own world, I was so determined, and I was so sure that I was doing the right thing that I knew I could not be harmed. Because I was doing the right thing. All I really wanted was for Wells Fargo management to say, thank you. Thank you for bringing it up. We will look into it. They never even acknowledged that I said that. But again, I brought all my emails. I started collecting, because the manager would say, well, no one's brought in any complaints to me. And then I said, well, they don't speak English. So they're bringing it to me. Well, have them bring their own interpreter. Because if I don't have any complaints, then it's not happening. So sometime later later that year, we filed a lawsuit against Wells Fargo for wrongful termination. Again, I had all the proof. I had a big banker's box full of documentation. People were signing affidavits and say, this is what happened. I didn't request it. Not only that, and I don't mean to give anybody any ideas. Everybody seems to be very, very decent people, but just bear with me. All the banks are regulated the same, or should be regulated the same. In 2011, after the 9/11 attacks, the banks created a regulation called the Patriot Act. And that meant that in order for you or any bank institution to open an account, you have to have 2 forms of ID. And this was in order to prevent a terrorist from opening accounts and using money on an American system. 2 forms of ID. A driver's license, a passport, and then a secondary form of ID. So they have very specific lists as to what you can use. Every single bank in the United States has to abide by that rule, except for Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo is even partnered with the Mexican consulate, and me being a Mexican national, I was very upset, and I've been calling and I've been pestering the Mexican consulate because Wells Fargo allows Mexican nationals to open a bank account using a Mexican ID that is not approved under the Patriot Act. That's exactly my question. How can they continue to do this? So what I want is for the bank regulators to do their job. There has to be a bank police that slaps them on the hand, but not only slap them on the hand, because just last week there was an article with CNN that said in the last 20 months, Wells Fargo has been fined $1.8 billion. And this all started in 2016. So I'm going to backtrace a little bit. I filed my lawsuit in 2010, and I lost. Little me against the big giant Wells Fargo. I lost. It happens to be a Wells Fargo San Francisco-based company, and they were trialed here in San Francisco. So the odds were just stacked against me. So I lost. My case was so strong that we appealed, and again, I lost. So then after that, I was just like, okay, forget it, I'm done, I'm tired, this is so tiring, you have to tell your story over and over and over again. And so not until late of 2016, and it had been, 4 years later, I just thought, I'm done. And I kept my box with all the documents. I shredded everything. Finally, I was like, okay, I'm ready to move on. Nothing's going to happen. Wells Fargo's never going to give me the public acknowledgement or public apology that, you were right. Thank you for doing the right thing. That never happened, and it's never happened to this day. And then late in 2016, I started getting calls from a lot of reporters from the New York Times, from the Washington Post. So it turns out that there's a congressional hearing where John Stump was being interrogated And a senator from Oregon found out about my case and confronted Stump. You know, now you say, Mr. Stump, now you say that people should have told you that this was happening and alerted you. Well, someone did, and that was me. And what happened to her? And he said, I'll just save you the trouble. You fired her. And, you know, he went on to say different examples, like homeless people with 9 checking accounts. How do you explain that? Why would they need 9 checking accounts? So, and, you know, they started remembering about my case. Well, I reported it since 2008. It started when I first witnessed it was in 2008. So now 8 years later, it's come up. And I start giving interviews, and you know, I'm hoping something happens, and really nothing happens. So then the last one, I'm thinking, like, I did that for like 2 or 3 months, which was very, very exhausting. But one of the last interviews that I had was with Liz Wagner from CBS, NBC, thank you, NBC investigator. So before she interviewed me, she said, do you know what happened with your case with OHSA? And I said, no, I don't know what OHSA, I know OHSA. My family has restaurants, and I associate OHSA with restaurants and health department coming to inspect that everything's safe. So, and she says, well, it turns out that the investigator that was assigned your case is this guy. His name is Darrell Whitman, and he was the one that took your case. And now he's a whistleblower for OHSA. And he said that you should have been reinstated because Wells Fargo never responded and they never did your investigation. He was given specific orders to close my case without investigating. And then I just thought, wow, I never knew that. Like all these years, I have never known. So not only is Wells Fargo doing all this dark, crazy fraud, it goes to OHSA, who's under the Department of Labor, who's under the Department of Justice. They've all known about it and have done nothing about it. So I have not met Darrell in person, but immediately after that interview, I requested to get in touch with him, so I wanted to personally thank him. He wanted to apologize. The first thing out of his, on his email was, first of all, I need to apologize because I just did what I was told to do. Close your case. But he remembered. And you know, what are the odds that the investigator and me were able to connect? Just recently, March 27th, I received an award from the Northern California Society of Professional Journalists. Sorry, that's long, I had to write it. And it's called the James Madison Freedom of Information Award. I was really honored to get that award. That's usually given to journalists, and I said, I'm not a journalist, but I guess me being vocal about it and expressing my case and wanting to bring awareness to people like you and me of what to do and not to allow Wells Fargo to continue what they're doing, I guess they thought I deserved the award. So I received it, and I'm really honored for that. And then A equals R. Also in my training, right above the box, that was also Wells Fargo formula. That was the very first thing that came out of my instructor's mouth. A equals R. And what they said it meant, it says actions equals results. So in banking terms, if I didn't do the right actions, I was not going to get the right amount of checking accounts. But you can apply that to anything that you want. I'm going to give another example, dieting. If I continue to eat whatever I want to eat and not exercise, I'm going to get the same results. I'm going to keep my weight. Unless I change my activity, I'm not going to change my results. That should be applied to Wells Fargo and all the companies that are bullying, because we are the ones that need to change. We need to change the actions, and we need to demand change for better protection for the workers so that we can have different results. If we don't do that, we continue to have the same results as we have been getting today. And then I'm just going to close with Albert Einstein's quote that says, the world's a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it.
Actually, it's because of the good people
No, it's not because of the evil. It's because we've witnessed a lot of things and we don't do anything about it.
After the evil, it's good. But what good people are not doing anything about it.
So when I was fired, the day that I was fired, my manager said, "Give me your keys, clear your desk, and go home." And she said, "You're in insubordination." And again, I didn't know what that meant. But I figured it can't be anything good because she's asking for my key and she's asking me to clear my desk, and they brought a little box. So I knew I was fired. But I saw it coming. Like, I knew it was coming. At least I was somewhat prepared that it was going to be happening. All the other bankers and tellers knew that this was happening, and I would be their voice. But when they saw me getting fired, no one said a peep. And I remember walking out, and I said, "I need to say goodbye to my friends." I went around and I spoke to all the tellers and all the bankers, and I said, "You guys just witnessed me getting fired. It's almost as if I fell and no one's helping me get up. I'm doing this for you." And I left. And when I saw that, I related to that moment. Eventually, Wells Fargo said, "No, you were never fired. What are you talking about?" It was all a misunderstanding because they knew there was going to be a wrongful termination lawsuit. So anyways, here I am. I'm really hoping that something happens. 2 years ago, Wells Fargo admitted of opening the 2 million fake accounts, which contradicts my lawsuit that was lost, because the judge said that I lost my case because I didn't meet my quotas. I didn't open my 8 accounts every single day. So now my hopes are to be able to go back to Wells Fargo and say, "Now you've admitted, so somebody lied under oath during my trial, and I should have won. But I just now know that the case is just much bigger and dirtier than I initially thought because the government's involved. And there's not very many lawyers that would want to work against the government. So it's up to people like you and I to bring awareness. I'm not doing a campaign to ask people to close accounts at Wells Fargo. But if you have an account, Wells Fargo has been dinged with insurance fraud, mortgage fraud, bank account fraud, credit card fraud. What else do we need in order for us to make the move? You guys hear about it on the news. You guys hear about it in the newspaper. So Wells Fargo is this big table, and the four legs are the customers. We need to start pulling those customers away so something happens to Wells Fargo. Thank you.
I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, live as you and me. Said I, "But Joe, you're 10 years dead." "I never died," said he. "I never died," said he. "The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They shot you, Joe," says I. "Takes more than guns to kill a man," says Joe. "I didn't die," said Joe. "I didn't die." In Salt Lake City, Joe, says I, him standing by my bed. "They framed you on a murder charge," says Joe, "but I ain't dead," says Joe, "but I ain't dead." And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, the man that guns could never kill went on to organize, went on to organize. From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill where workers strike to defend their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. it's there you'll find Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Said I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, said he. I never died, said he. I never died, said he.
300 workers died the other day. And you can say that. It's a blues, so you can say it. 300 workers died the other day. And then the answer is, it's the free market. We all get to play. Right, Steve? We all get to play. 350 workers burned up in Pakistan. 350 workers burned up in Pakistan. 100 years ago, it was New York City land. That's where the Triangle Factory was. And then we go back to labor history. I don't know what year it was, 1808 or something like 1908. The miners were shot down. 450 miners shot down in 1908. 450 miners shot down in 1908. Don't it work, make your working class heart, make your working class heart ache. Makes my heart ache. Then in 2012, they shot down 40 South African miners. Same capitalist class. 40 South African miners shot down in 2012. 40 South African miners shot down in 2012.
We can fight and send those bosses to hell.
Yeah. We got the power. We can send them bosses to hell. Oh, yeah. Then the chorus is, they never change, they never change. It's the same old. Yeah, we got it. They never change, they never change. They shoot us down without shame. They never change. It's that same old capitalist game. Then Steve was involved with the Turkish workers over in Gezi Park, so I had a verse for him. Gezi Park is burning right now. Gezi Park is burning right now. Truth to power, rise up, world workers somehow. And let's talk about a little bit about racism. Tamir Rice, he ain't got no rights. Tamir Rice, he ain't got no rights. We ain't got no choice. We ain't got no choice, but we gots to fight. Thousands of families poisoned in Flint, Michigan. Thousands of families poisoned in Flint, Michigan. It's time to raise the banner and join that fight once again. And the last chorus is, they never change, they never change. They shoot us down without shame. Let's say that again together. They never change, they never change, they shoot us down without shame. And the last verse, they never change, they never change. It's that same old dirty, rotten, low-down capitalist game.
My name's Ahimsa, and my dad, George Donald Porter, was a career longshoreman. He was a walking boss and a shipping clerk for American President Lines. And Harry Bridges might as well have been at the dinner table. You know, my dad was a card-carrying member of the ILWU, and he would come home with photos that he had taken at the shipyard. We had albums full of photos that he had taken. My son is the keeper of the archives. And I can remember when I was 5 years old, we were living in the Potrero Hill housing projects. My dad would drive up in his old Buick, license plate BYN 499. You know, 5-year-olds remember a lot. You know, and he'd just come down the walk, you know, swinging his metal lunch pail that always had a treat in it that my mother hadn't put in there that morning, wearing his steel-toed boots. And you know, he was a handsome guy with a big smile and told corny jokes, and a lot of the kids in the neighborhood didn't have dads, and I was fortunate, and many of them would join me in greeting him. I stayed with my dad for a while on Silver Avenue in a house in Bayview while I was in medical training. And in 1992, I don't want to make the story sound as if it was a fairy tale, because me and my dad, we had our differences. We actually, you know, had some major conflicts, but we had resolved a lot of our conflicts by February of 1992. In fact, on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1992, we went shopping at the local Safeway, and he bought me a box of Godiva chocolates. And on February 19th, the morning of February 19th, he didn't come up for breakfast, and I knew something was wrong, and I went downstairs, and I found him dead. He was 58 years old. He died prematurely. He was a career longshoreman, and he was forced into retirement, into a medical disability, early retirement. And I am the physician on his death certificate, and I ordered his medical record. I was at that time a physician specialist with the Department of Public Health, and I thought that I should get the medical record just to be sure of what was going on. And there was the chest x-ray, and the chest x-ray demonstrated some signs of fibrosis in his lungs that were consistent with pulmonary asbestosis. And my dad hadn't told me about it, but he had contacted lawyers with a firm called Wartnick Law Firm, one of the city's largest, and as a result of his death, as a result of that chest x-ray, a class action lawsuit ensued that was settled, and it did benefit my family, and it benefited a number of other workers. So that's a little bit about how I am here. But significantly, I also worked as a attending physician for the Persian Gulf Agent Orange Ionizing Radiation Registry at the Palo Alto Veterans Administration, and I would see the veterans come in. The Vietnam veterans were some of the most disabled of the veterans that I saw. There were a class of veterans called the Atomic Vets, the veterans that had been active in the military in the post-World War II era. And I can remember the first time I had one of the Atomic Vets come in, and you referenced what one of them told me, that he had been called aboard a ship. He was on a ship in the Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific in the post-World War II era, and he was called on board a ship and without any type of protective gear was exposed to massive blasts of ionizing radiation. There were megaton atomic bombs that were dropped on ships in the Bikini Atoll, and this was part of an experiment that was deliberately conducted to see what the impacts of atomic radiation were. These ships were hauled back to the Hunters Point Shipyard, which incidentally was working with Treasure Island. It was a joint naval station, and that's important for historical reasons because there's a lot of focus right now on residual radiation at Treasure Island, and based on what we know in the historical archives, there is reason to believe that. So I remember the first time one of those atomic vets told me that story, I didn't believe it. It was just too phantasmagorical. You know, I just couldn't wrap my mind around that type of reality. And so I dismissed it. I was seeing a lot of vets, especially the Vietnam War vets with PTSD, who were often psychotic. Some of your Persian Gulf vets were also coming back with PTSD. So I just dismissed it, you know, as being something that might have been, you know, delusional or you know, a hallucination or even psychotic, although the atomic vets, for the most part, tended to be more intact than many of your other groups of veterans. And so I heard it again, and I heard it again. You know, I was in a role where I was to interview these veterans and then to determine what kind of testing and what kind of follow-up and what kind of referrals they needed for their, you know, their health needs. So I did hear repeatedly from this class of veterans called the Atomic Vets about their experience being exposed to ionizing radiation blasts in that post-World War II era. I chaired the radiological subcommittee of the Hunters Point Shipyard Restoration Advisory Board. I was the founding chair in 2001, and I had access to information that was being declassified, and for the first time it was entering the public domain about the extent of residual radiation at the shipyard. And again, this was in 2001, and there are some documents that have come out of the studies of radiation activities at the shipyard. One is called the Historical Radiological Assessment, and it looks at the use of radioactive materials from 1939 up until 2004. And the scope of radiological activity is enormous, and what we're seeing now is the result of unbridled development on properties on a federal Superfund site that was never safe for human habitation to begin with, but we've already discussed and talked about some of the political, some of the economic engines that have been driving the shipyard development. We're looking at a situation right now that you're reading about in the Chronicle. It's ironic that the Chronicle is on board. The Chronicle, for most of its years, has not given a great deal of focus to the impacts, the human impacts, the health and safety impacts of the shipyard development. It has acted in concert with the political powers and overlords who've been driving the shipyard development. But you're aware right now that this Navy contractor, Tetra Tech, has engaged in a collection of soil samples on radiation-contaminated regions of the base and was caught doing it by Navy computers. The Navy computers caught Tetra Tech for a simple reason. The shipyard has so much residual ionizing radiation that when these radiation control technicians, which are supposed to be intelligent, licensed individuals, turned in post-remediation soil samples, from clean soil they'd gotten someplace, the computers detected immediately that this profile didn't meet the soils at the shipyard, and the substance that triggered the computers most source was radioactive potassium. The soils at the shipyard have such residual high levels of radioactive potassium K40 that when they went and got some clean soil and thought they could just substitute it and say, look, we cleaned it up, the computer said, bing, this is not the Huntersport Shipyard, So, I mean, I don't mean to laugh. It is humorous, to think that this level of stupidity was at play. But what is scary is that the Tetra Tech workers, the radiation control technicians and the project managers were working together. This was a large orchestrated effort, and you may be seeing in the headlines that Tetra Tech is denying that it engaged in fraud. This is laughable because in 2012, Tetra Tech investigated itself and published a report in 2014 that documents, after investigating itself, that 2,500 anomalous soil samples were collected and that the majority were fraud. They took action against several of the employees. One of the employees who was linked to the collection of the fraudulent samples by virtue of the chain of custody of the samples was named Ray Roberson. And Ray Roberson, who faced an enormous amount of criminal and civil liability, as well as the potential for, opening up the cleanup to, investigations that could conceivably shut down the project. Mr. Roberson very, very conveniently and very amazingly rolled over and died, at the end of the investigation. So Mr. Roberson's cause of death, I have not been able to determine. I have tried to be, very, diligent about pressing the issue of this suspiciously timed death, and I think that ultimately we will get some answers. One of the radiation control technicians who worked with Mr. Roberson believes that his cause of death was due to quote-unquote foul play, and that certainly, makes sense to me. I do want to talk to you about another hero. Chris Carpenter was working on Parcel A of the shipyard in 2006, and he was working for another Navy contractor, and the role of that contractor was to grade down a huge hill, and at the top of the hill is Hunters Point, where there's public housing, children playing, some schools, and other quote-unquote sensitive receptors. There were two contractors, one Gordon Ball and another Hill, that was to monitor the dust that it was being generated, and when the dust exceeded in particulates or asbestos safe concentrations, there's supposed to be a work shutdown, and there had been a number of work shutdowns. There were also failures of the monitoring system, but Christopher Carpenter was working on Parcel A one day when the dust that was being generated was visible, and triggered the monitors to shut down the work. There was a work shutdown, and so most of the workers went home. They were told that, they needed to go home, and they went home. Chris Carpenter looked up the hill and noticed that, the workers are going home, but up the hill on a playground, there are kids playing, and he deduced that if it wasn't safe for workers to breathe this dust, it certainly wasn't safe for these kids. And so he went up to this schoolyard. It was the schoolyard of the Muhammad University of Islam, and he notified Minister Christopher Muhammad of the work shutdowns and other dangerous conditions that were going on as part of this massive grading activity. So that got the ball rolling on a huge event that occurred between the years 2006, 2007. There were some lawsuits filed. It took several months for members of the community to find out that they were being exposed to very dangerous levels of asbestos. Chris Carpenter lost his job. His supervisor found out that he had broke this expected code of silence and warned the community about the dangers of the grading activities. And it's reported that he actually got into a physical altercation and was fired. The good news is that Chris Carpenter went on and established his own business, did very, very well, cared for his wife and his kids, bought a great, big, beautiful home, and was doing okay for several years until he developed some very vague cardiorespiratory symptoms, some skin symptoms, and some weakness, and he was evaluated and found to have a cancer called a peripheral T-cell lymphoma. You don't have to remember that. All you have to remember is that Chris Carpenter was African American and that there were no cases of peripheral T-cell lymphoma reported in African Americans in the United States of America, period. So this was a unique event. Peripheral T-cell lymphomas, which I researched because in 2015, attorneys from a high-powered New York law firm called Whites and Luxembourg traveled to San Francisco to talk to me and other people because they were representing Chris Carpenter. And they believed Chris Carpenter when he told them that he thought that this rare cancer was a result of these massive unprotected exposures that he had to toxic dust working as a Parcel A shipyard worker. So when I researched peripheral T-cell lymphoma, I was only able to find 6 cases of it in the world in Black people, and they were 6 people in a cluster in the Caribbean in a region where people were being exposed to toxic environmental contaminants. So by that time, Chris was facing imminent death and facing it very, very bravely. He did go on to live, for another year, but in 2016, he did die as a result of the cancer disseminating throughout his body. It was a stage 4 lymphoma at the time of his death. So I have been terribly moved by Chris's story. I was moved by Chris's story when I talked to Robin Greenwald, the attorney with Whites in Luxembourg, but I wasn't able to find Chris. The name was too common, and I checked Facebook and, searched him, but I wasn't able to find, him and contact him directly. But I did attend a meeting, a community meeting that was called recently, and I had an opportunity to meet his wife, Daniela, and then I, found Chris's Facebook page, and these are some photos from his Facebook page. So, the good news is that even though Chris Carpenter died as a result of his death and as a result of this mushrooming scandal that we're seeing at the shipyard, surrounding the fraudulent cleanup of the radiation-contaminated parcels, there is going to be a mass action, class action lawsuit filed, and surprise, surprise, it's going to be filed on May 1st. So you're going to hear about it. But there are a number of plaintiffs. There are people in the adjacent community who've been identified who have cancer, and clearly, Christopher is a very, very strong plaintiff in this case. So just like my dad, Christopher Carpenter is a hero. He should be memorialized. I would love to see a physical memorial, a statue erected at the shipyard in memory of Christopher Carpenter. And if I can ask you to remember his name, I met Christopher, you know, at the time that he was being hailed as a hero after he'd lost his job and, you know, had alerted the community. By the way, in October of 2007, the San Francisco Board of Education voted unanimously to shut down the development activities that Lennar was conducting at the shipyard. And this was really a big event that the Board of Education bucked all of the political pressures and made this vote unanimous. And in their resolution, in the opening paragraphs that I sent to Steve Zeltzer, there is a reference to Christopher Carpenter's role in, you know, being a whistleblower who alerted the community heroically and has, in effect, died, you know, as a result of his exposures. So please remember his name. I was going to say I met him. He was a really handsome guy. You see the photos of him. He was a really handsome guy. He's the kind of guy you kind of think of as being a hero, you know, just minding his business, taking care of his family, going to work. You know, and that's what happens to heroes. They just end up doing things that are extraordinary in the process of doing, just doing their job, you know. So again, remember his name, and if there's anything that I can impress upon you is the need for us to erect in our minds and in our spirits and to erect physical monuments in memory of these people who have taken outstanding stances, you know, on behalf of themselves, on behalf of their families, on behalf of their communities, and ultimately on behalf of all humankind. So thank you so much.
So hi, everyone. My name is Cheryl Thornton, and I work for the Department of Public Health for 28 years. I work in the Potrero Hill Health Clinic that was started by the residents who lived in the public housing. And the reason that they started the clinic is because in this marginalized community in District 10, there really was no health care. People would have to go to General Hospital, to the emergency room, to try to get primary care, and oftentimes they would go back home and die. There was lots of cancer and asthma in the community because of all the toxins that were there. So in 2006, I started working in the health clinic in 1991. But what I noticed is there was oftentimes a disparity of treatment for a lot of the African American patients that would come into the clinic. And there was a lot of mental illness and a lot of cancer and a lot of things going on. But the patients were treated in a way where they couldn't really have access and they would get sick and die. So in 2006, I became a whistleblower because I noticed that I was customer service oriented and I wanted to advocate for the community. So we started filing complaints about the disparate treatment. And in 2006, then, I guess I was removed from my job, but I went and filed a case with the EEOC, and through mediation, I was returned back to my work site. So recently, again, for advocating for people in the community, I was removed from my job again for going back to the whistleblower hotline in just this year, in 2018. But I guess what I really want to say tonight is, what I'm thinking here is that the privatization in public services is driving a lot of this corruption. It's all about profit. I noticed like our health department and General Hospital, it's being privatized. Mark Zuckerberg invested and it's being privatized. The clinics that people fought for to have access to health care, the marginalized, it's being privatized. The school on the hill where we live, it's being privatized. And the reason that all this privatization is happening, it's for profit. It's the same thing that happened at Wells Fargo. It's for profit. And unions are no longer popular, especially here in San Francisco. San Francisco is just being privatized. And at first, I thought the discrimination was, racially based, but it's not just racially based, it's economically based or class based. And so many people are being forced out of here. It's the gentrification that's going on. And I was thinking today when I was in church, why didn't I just turn and not report what I saw? And the reason I didn't and couldn't is because of my value system and what I believe in and what I was raised to believe in. And I just feel that everyone should have equal opportunity. Everyone here in America, we're all Americans, and we all deserve equal opportunity. And that's not happening. And I think that all the stories I heard, I thought I had some grit, but boy, did Chris really have some grit. I mean, I think that we just need to realize and educate the community. Thank God for Steve educating me about all this privatization, because that's really what's going on. And so I'm not going to go into my whole whistleblower story, but I can tell you that I was removed from my job recently. I was sent to the call center for advocating for marginalized people. And I'm hoping that they return me back to, restore me to where we're advocating for me to be restored to where I worked for 28 years. I dedicated my life. I started there in high school as a volunteer. I could have left there, but I stayed there because I see that people of color really need ways in to mainstream. And what I mean is you have places like UCSF that's private, well, it's state, but kind of quasi-private. They come to the community, they run their grants, they provide medical care, but what they don't do is provide an economic base for marginalized people to find a way out of poverty. And so, again, privatization is what we're really all fighting. Whether you're white, you're black, you're brown, you're yellow, we're fighting that. It's all about profit. It's all about the mighty dollar, the 1%. And I just want to see more people, and especially more young people, get involved. I was at San Francisco State last week, and the same thing is happening there. They call it the People's College, but it's being privatized. And soon, the average person will not be able to get a college education. Well, a bachelor's degree now is just like a high school diploma. And if you don't even have a bachelor's degree as a person of color, you're not even going to go in the door. So, again, we need to all read and be more educated and reach out to as many people as we can about this privatization and to try to build a stronger movement and to try to stop it so that we can all continue to live here in this city or in Oakland or any of the other major cities. So thank you.
All right, 2018 Workers' Memorial. My name's Edward Escobar. I'm the founder of the Alliance for Independent Workers. We advocate and lobby on behalf of the rideshare industry drivers. It is a component of the greater gig economy, part of the on-demand portion, which is 9%, actually 10% at this time, and growing, as you know. We're looking at the gig economy being a third of the workforce presently nationwide. In the next few years, 40%. By 2027, it's projected to be 50%. and that's corporations not assuming their fair share responsibility to provide a sustainable living for workers. So they are relying, of course, on the gig economy, which is something that Uber used in a recent commercial that was about getting your side hustle on. Now, I don't know about any of you folks, but when I was young, you know, the side hustle is just, hustling is not good, and on the side is even more shady. So that being said, myself, I still am actually a full-time driver, 4 years plus, and I've driven with 10 different apps. So that's Uber, Lyft, Sidecar, Summons, the list goes on. Some of them are already out of business. Being in the trenches gives me a special perspective on what's going on. So that's why I stay rolling hard. On behalf of all the workers, and it is essential, of course, that it be kept real and as real as possible, especially from an advocacy standpoint. I want to speak to, since it is regarding the memorial of workers, a very tragic incident, as you see, with the privatization of this public transportation, as was mentioned prior. It's happening all over. And you have Uber, Lyft drivers in the numbers of 2 million plus nationwide, globally 4 million and growing. That's only a small percentage of the overall impact of this new abuse of independent contractors, which they call us, but we're actually treated less than employees. So we're not even given any types of possibilities for sustainability. And that's rather tragic, because to be called an independent contractor before, which I've been most of my life, I understand what that means legally. And this is strictly and blatantly a violation of the classification of what it means to be an independent contractor. We're looking at misclassification of employment. It's very clear and obvious. We just spoke recently to the CPUC and presented our case. They've moved partially in the direction of reclassifying Uber from a TNC to a TCP, which means that as a chartered party carrier, which they would be in part, then they would have to assume part of their fair share contribution to the workers' safety net. And that's a significant thing for consideration for most people, because they don't understand what that means. Is that if Uber and Lyft are just basically profiting, and it's all about corporate bottom line profits, then they're Walmartizing the rideshare industry. And what that means is they're passing the pain of the bill onto taxpayers. So with the onset of and the ever-present advancement of technology, we're looking at self-driving cars on the horizon. And it's going to be here sooner than what you think. They already have self-driving trailer trucks, semis in Arizona that are hitting the road. So imagine if they have semis on the road, cars are a small, short distance away. They've already tried to pass that on to San Francisco and guinea pig the residents of San Francisco. Fortunately, a number of us have stood up, and the State Attorney General's office, in cooperation with the DMV, had the license pulled for Uber and had them remove their vehicles. But this being a memorial for workers, I want to highlight this tragic event. As you see, workers are being squeezed to the point of being unsustainable, and they feel that there is no way out. On February 6, 2018, Doug Shifter, a livery driver in his early 60s, killed himself with a shotgun blast to the head in front of New York City Hall, having written a lengthy Facebook post several hours earlier, laying out the structural cruelties that had left him in such dire circumstances. Doug was sometimes forced to work more than 100 hours a week just to survive. Compared to when he started in the 1980s, when a 40-hour work week was fairly typical. Working more and more and making less and less. Doug blamed politicians, mayors Michael R. Bloomberg, Bill de Blasio, and Governor Andrew M. Cuomo. They're catering to the rich and permitting so many cars to flood the streets of New York. He blamed the Taxi Commission for extreme fines and constant hassles it imposed. Losing his health insurance and accruing too much credit card debt, he could no longer work for quote-unquote chump change. Preferring, he said, to die in the hope that his sacrifice would draw attention to the worsening plight of drivers that were too often unable to feed their families, struggling to survive. He warned of this impending doom in columns that he wrote for a trade publication, Black Card News. He wrote and wrote and wrote, but few listened. In Doug's testament was the growing frustration and anger he felt over the deprofessionalization of his life's work. Doug drove for more than 5 million miles through his career, through 5 hurricanes and 50 snowstorms. He chauffeured celebrities and always wore a suit with a smile. He was not driving a car to supplement his income. This was his full-time job that he did with pride and professionalism. He was not a participant in the gig economy. He was a casualty of it. This driver's suicide reveals the dark side of the gig economy. Doug Shifter, dead at age 61. As you can see, this is just a small picture on the growing problem that we are facing. In New York alone, there's been 4 suicides already in the recent past. And this is all attributed to the tightening of the noose around the worker's neck. Here alone, we have a number of documented cases where even taxi drivers sitting in their cars have just passed due to workers' exhaustion. Workers' exhaustion, in case you don't know, is worse than driving drunk. So we're dealing with a problem here that needs to be addressed sooner than later. And it impacts people on so many different levels. This is not about drivers and fair fares just for them, about how much money, because people always say, well, get another job. Well, some folks, it's easier than others. Uber, Lyft, they target specific groups, segments of the population for recruitment. You're looking at immigrants, low income, minorities, seniors, disabled, veterans, students, ex-felons, and single moms. So these are soft targets. They get kicked hard, they roll over, they say, thank you, please just don't deactivate me. Because they have a lot on the line. These folks have invested heavily. They've brought in a personal vehicle. For some, in case you don't know, personal vehicle is going to be the largest investment that they're going to make in their whole lives because they can't qualify for a home. So we're looking at this problem being ever increasing. These folks do not have a voice. That's where we come in. So it's the voiceless many. And these people are being used and abused and kicked to the curb. So it goes beyond that segment that's being impacted. We're looking at something that's even more significant is public safety. So whether you're a driver, a rider, or not, maybe just a pedestrian, maybe just a bicyclist, maybe just driving your car, you can be impacted just as well. You see traffic congestion, well, that leads into the direction of the environment. And as we had touched on earlier, privatization of public transportation. So if you use the bus service, you use BART, Barrier Rapid Transit, they're reducing service. Paratransit for seniors, disabled, they're reducing service. So these folks are all being impacted because of this. You know, Uber, Lyft come in, they promise this utopic solution to the transportation infrastructure. But it's dystopic truly in nature, and you can see it. It's done typically in the bait and switch process, which is always benefiting the corporate bottom line profits. But eventually, the taxpayers will have to fund that. As I said earlier, it's the Walmartization of rideshare. People, this is a very serious concern. This is the Uberization of the world. Technology is looking at Uber as being the head that is to be imitated. But I look at it as the head of the snake. So we need to address that. It is very sad. It's very tragic. Lyft, let's not forget about Lyft, because Lyft, to me, is the mini-me to the Dr. Evil Uber. And it's something that cannot be said enough times. There was a delete Uber campaign, and people thought by going over to Lyft that was going to make things better, and that was going to really show Uber, bad Uber. But that JFK strike that occurred, that Uber violated, well, Lyft was right behind them. So we have to keep that in mind, and Lyft has grown on the misfortune of Uber. They're both behaving badly. These are corporations that are behaving very badly. And as you know, it's up to us to make that difference by having our voices heard. Privatization of public transportation is just bad news. And with this globalization, Uberization model, as I mentioned earlier, they are these tech firms, the titans of tech. And you're looking at a multi-billion-dollar corporation that their end game is to push to self-driving vehicles. As I mentioned earlier, what's that going to do to the workforce? By 2021, Lyft says half of our driving fleet is going to be self-driving. So all those folks that were recruited and promised the world, well, misrepresentation, whether intentional or not, and we know this is for corporate profit, so it is intentional. Misrepresentation is a form of fraud that is criminal. So these are things that need to be addressed. We are lobbying, we are speaking out, we are unifying drivers. It's something that the public has to take an interest in, because if not now, I don't want to repeat that comment, but too big to fail, remember? You've heard that. Well, when they get really big, then politicians, they seem to kind of stay away because they don't want to get their hands dirty. And it's something that we have to remind them, you work for us, do your job, do your job. And that being said, we're lobbying. We're meeting with politicians, both locally, regionally, statewide, and as well as nationally. So it's something that is significant. Presently, we are lobbying with Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez from the 80th Assembly District. AB 3080 in California is ending forced waivers of workers' rights. So it's basically ending forced arbitration. And the NDAs, the non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality agreements that accompany that. They're using these on folks and really getting them to be forced into the kangaroo courts that are always favorable to the corporations. And this is something that we can't allow to continue to happen. So, as the founder of the Alliance for Independent Workers and also a driver, I'd like to end by saying and quoting a famous Mario Savio, who stated that, and I'll just try to say it as best as possible in the way that he did. There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all. Thank you.